Can you imagine being told in your own home by your own daughter-in-law to eat outside with the dogs? That's exactly what happened to me. In that single shattering moment, I felt a betrayal so deep it could have broken me. But instead, it awakened something I never knew existed within my 68-year-old soul. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and for most of my life, I've been a woman who's given ground for love. I gave in when my late husband, Arthur, wanted to paint the house blue instead of green. I gave in when my son, Edward, chose engineering over the family business. And I kept giving in, even after becoming a widow, when the crushing weight of loneliness settled over me like a cold, wet blanket in the dead of winter. This house here in Willow Creek, Oregon, has witnessed every chapter of my life. Laughter, tears, celebrations, farewells. Every creaking floorboard, every faint crack in the wall, holds a story. Arthur and I built this home literally with the sweat of our brows. 40 years I taught at St. Michael's Elementary. 40 years we saved every single dollar, passing on vacations, denying ourselves luxuries, all for the dream of our own roof over our heads. Arthur, he didn't get to enjoy it as long as we'd hoped. Cancer stole him from me 5 years ago, leaving me with faded photographs, a lifetime of memories, and a house that felt far too big for just one person. So when Edward lost his job at the construction company, a part of me, my mother's heart, saw it as a sign. My son, my only son, would come home with his wife, Lillian, and my 2 grandchildren, David and Sophie. I dared to hope these walls would once again echo with life, with laughter. After years of hearing only the soft shuffle of my own footsteps, I poured all my anticipation into preparing their rooms, buying fresh flowers, baking Arthur's favorite homemade bread, cleaning every forgotten corner. I wanted them to feel not just welcome but at home. This was their sanctuary too. The day they arrived, I hugged Edward so tightly. He was thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, that defeated look of a man carrying the world. My heart ached for him. David, my oldest grandson, embraced me with that gentle affection that reminds me so much of Arthur. Sophie, though she barely offered a glance, too engrossed in her phone. And then there was Lillian with her perfectly styled hair, and a smile that, even then, never quite reached her eyes. "Thank you for having us, Eleanor," she said, her voice sweet, almost sugary, but with an underlying edge as cold as steel. "It'll be temporary, of course. As soon as Edward finds another job, we'll go back to our own place." Something in her tone made me feel like a stranger in my own home, a visitor. But I pushed the feeling away. These are difficult times, I reasoned. Losing a job can wound a man's pride, especially with a wife like Lillian, accustomed to a certain lifestyle. The first few hours passed in a flurry of suitcases and decisions. Lillian, without a moment's hesitation, laid claim to the master bedroom, the one Arthur and I had shared for 30 years. I didn't object. They needed their space after all. I could sleep perfectly well in the smaller room overlooking the garden, where the birds sang to me every morning. That first evening I prepared a special dinner. My mother's beef stew recipe, the very same one I'd cooked for Edward when he was a boy, coming home ravenous from basketball. I set the table with my fine china, the set only used for the most special occasions. I lit candles, even uncorked a bottle of wine Arthur and I had been saving for an important celebration. The family is together again, I thought as I stirred the pot. That's reason enough to celebrate. At 8 o'clock sharp, I called everyone to the table. David was the first, helping me serve. Edward appeared, looking weary but offering me a genuine smile at the sight of the stew. Sophie slumped into her chair, phone still in hand. Finally, Lillian swept in, hair freshly done, wearing a dress that seemed far too elegant for a family dinner. I remember every single detail, as if it were happening right now. The steam curling from the plates, the scent of fresh herbs from my garden, the soft clinking of silverware against my precious china. Everything felt perfect, a warm family scene, just like the ones I dreamed of during my years of solitude. I was serving the last plate, my own, when Lillian's silverware clattered sharply against the table, echoing in the suddenly silent room. She fixed me with those dark, bottomless eyes and uttered the words that changed everything. "I'm in charge of this house now. Take your plate and go eat outside with the dogs." Time stopped. David's fork dropped with a metallic clink. Edward went pale, but he said nothing. his eyes glued to his plate as if the stew had become the most fascinating thing in the world. Sophie let out a nervous giggle, looking at her mother with a mixture of awe and admiration. And me? I felt as though I'd been drenched in a bucket of icy water. It wasn't just the humiliation, though that cut deep. It was seeing my son, my Edward, the boy I had raised with every ounce of my love, sit there and say absolutely nothing. He didn't defend me. He remained silent, accepting that his wife would treat me like a servant in my own home. I could have screamed. I could have wept. I could have demanded respect. But in that moment, something inside me, something dormant for far too long, awakened. A quiet strength. An absolute, unwavering certainty of what I had to do. I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy, or even resignation. It was the smile of someone who, after years adrift in a fog, finally sees with perfect clarity. I calmly rose, picked up the cordless phone from its charger beside the refrigerator, and dialed a number I knew by heart. Everyone was staring. Lillian defiant. Edward ashamed. David heartbroken. Sophie with teenage curiosity. "Who are you calling, Mom?" Edward finally managed, his voice weak, trembling. I didn't answer. I waited for the ring to be picked up on the other end. When I heard the familiar voice, I simply said, "Grace, the time has come. Activate Protocol Dawn." I hung up. Then, I sat back down at the table and began to eat my stew as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "What was that?" Lillian demanded, her tone no longer quite so confident. "Who did you call?" "A friend," I replied calmly. "You'll understand tomorrow. Now let's eat. It's getting cold." The rest of dinner passed in an uncomfortable silence. I could feel their confused glances, the tension thickening the air. Yet, I felt strangely at peace, as if a monumental weight had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, long after everyone else was asleep, I went out to the garden and sat with my dogs, those faithful companions who had never judged me, who offered their unconditional love without asking for a thing in return. I stroked their heads and whispered, "Things are going to change, my friends. Eleanor Hayes has remembered who she is." And that's how it all began. With a profound humiliation, a simple phone call, and a decision that would not only change my life but the lives of my entire family. Because what Lillian didn't know, what no one knew, was that I was already prepared for that moment. 5 years of widowhood had taught me many things, including the hard truth that I had to protect myself, even from those I loved the most. The next morning, I woke before everyone else, as has been my custom since I was young. There's something special about those first hours, when the world still seems asleep and your own thoughts ring clear. I made coffee, the aroma filling the kitchen, my kingdom, my sanctuary. I sat in my old rocking chair by the window, watching the first rays of sun kiss the flowers Arthur and I had planted together so many years ago. This house, our house, how much history these walls held. I remembered the day we bought it. Just a plot of land, foundations, and a million promises. Arthur, with his unbreakable optimism, took my hands and said, "We'll build our life here, Eleanor." And oh, how we did. Every brick laid was a sacrifice. Every wall raised, a dream fulfilled. I taught for 40 years at the neighborhood school, waking before dawn, grading papers late into the night, drying the tears of children who are now parents, even grandparents. 40 years of saving every dollar. Giving up vacations, new clothes, small luxuries, all for this home. Arthur worked at the car factory, often pulling double shifts, coming home with calloused hands and an aching back, but always with a smile for me and Edward. We never wanted for essentials, but we never had excess. When we finally paid off the last mortgage installment, Arthur's hair was white, and I needed reading glasses. Edward grew up here. He took his first steps on this very wooden floor that now creaks beneath my feet. He learned to ride his bike on the street outside, broke his arm falling from the tree in the backyard. His room still holds posters of his favorite teams, trophies, and books he never took when he married Lillian. Lillian entered our lives 20 years ago, when Edward was in college. She was beautiful, intelligent, ambitious. Arthur, with his trusting nature, welcomed her with open arms. I, though, felt a strange chill from the start. A distance, a coldness behind her perfect smile. I never mentioned it. I didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law. Maybe I should have been. They married young, too young in my opinion, but Edward was deeply in love. With our financial help, they bought a small downtown apartment. Soon David arrived, our first grandchild, and 3 years later Sophie. Lillian quit her job to dedicate herself to the children, which always struck me as odd given her independent nature. Edward was promoted, their income grew, they moved to a larger house in an upscale neighborhood. Our visits became scarcer. When Arthur fell ill, Edward usually came alone. Lillian is busy with the kids, he'd explain, though the children weren't so little anymore. During Arthur's 2-year illness, Lillian visited him in the hospital exactly 3 times. At the funeral, she cried tears that didn't quite reach her eyes, receiving condolences as if she were the primary mourner. I saw her observing the house with a calculating gaze as neighbors hugged me. After Arthur's death, loneliness hit me harder than ever. It's one thing to be alone. It's another entirely to feel alone. For months the house felt too vast, too silent. The spaces we once shared were constant reminders of his absence. His empty armchair, his side of the bed cold, his coffee cup untouched in the cupboard. Edward would visit on Sundays, sometimes with the children, almost never with Lillian. I noticed his concern, his glances, assessing if I could manage on my own. "Mom, have you thought about selling the house? It's too big for you," he suggested repeatedly. "You could buy something smaller, easier to maintain, maybe closer to us." I always refused. This house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the vessel of my memories, my last tangible link to Arthur. It was during those first raw months of grief that I met Doris Miller at the Widows Support Group at St. Michael's Parish. Doris, who'd lost her husband 2 years prior, owned a small shop nearby. She invited me for coffee, and that's where I met Grace Vance, her niece, a lawyer. That day changed my life. Doris told me her story, so similar yet so tragically different from mine. Her eldest son had convinced her to put the house in his name for security. 6 months later, he'd committed her to a nursing home against her will, to sell the property. Grace had legally rescued her, but the house was already lost. "Older people are vulnerable, Eleanor," Doris told me, pouring more coffee. "Especially women, especially widows. The world sees us as burdens, as incapable children, or as spoils to be divided." That night I couldn't sleep. Doris's words echoed in my mind. Could Edward be capable of something like that? I wanted to believe no, but his insistent suggestions to sell the house took on a chilling new meaning. And if not Edward, then what about Lillian? I'd seen her calculating gaze too many times. The following week, I visited Grace's law firm. I laid bare my worries, my fears. She didn't judge me, didn't call me paranoid. Instead, she shared stories of similar cases. Children dispossessing elderly parents, in-laws seizing control of properties. "Miss Hayes," she said, her voice firm yet kind, "love is wonderful, but legal paperwork protects. Trust is not a document that holds up in court." And that's how the New Dawn Foundation was born. My house, its first asset. Arthur's life insurance policy, its initial capital. Legally, the house was no longer mine. It belonged to the foundation, with the condition that I could live there for the rest of my life as its director. Any decision about the property had to go through the board of directors. Grace, Doris, Father Michael, and me. Robert Davies, my lifelong neighbor, a widower like me, heard about our project during one of our evening chats in the garden. He not only supported the idea but became one of our main donors. "This is what Arthur would have wanted," he told me one day. "For you to be protected, for your kindness to help others." In the years that followed, the foundation grew quietly. We helped 3 other widows protect their properties. We offered legal advice to dozens of seniors. We created a small emergency fund. All discreetly, without publicity, without my family knowing. Not because I completely distrusted Edward, but as a preventative measure. It's like an umbrella, I told myself. You hope you don't need it, but you carry it in case it rains. And then the storm came. Edward lost his job. The economy was bad. There were massive layoffs. At 42, with a mortgage, 2 teenagers, and an expensive lifestyle to maintain, my son was suddenly out of work. Sunday calls became more frequent. Questions about the house became more direct. "Mom, we've been thinking. The house is too big for you alone. We could move in temporarily until I find another job. It would be good for you to have company, and for us to save a little. I couldn't refuse. He's my son, my only son. And despite my reservations, the idea of having the house full again, of hearing my grandchildren's voices, filled me with a fragile hope. Maybe everything would work out, I thought. Maybe my precautions had been exaggerated. By the way, if you're still with me, still hooked on this unexpected twist, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss more unbelievable stories like mine. Protocol Dawn was Grace's idea. A rapid action plan in case the situation became untenable. A simple call would activate a series of legal measures designed to protect me and the foundation. I never thought I'd have to use it, much less on the first day of cohabitation. That night, after the disastrous dinner and the phone call, I slept surprisingly well. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly in control of my life, my destiny. Lillian's cruel words, instead of crushing me, had paradoxically liberated me. I no longer had to pretend, no longer had to endure to maintain a fictitious peace. The next morning, as I drank my early coffee, I received a message from Grace. All set. We'll be there at 10 o'clock. I took my time getting ready. I chose my blue dress, Arthur's favorite. I styled my hair carefully. I even put on a little makeup. If I was going to face a battle, I would do so with dignity. At 9:30, Lillian came down already dressed, as if for an important meeting. She looked at me with some surprise, perhaps expecting to find me devastated by the previous night's events. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said, that falsely sweet tone back. "What's for breakfast?" "Good morning, Lillian," I replied calmly. "There's fresh coffee, bread in the breadbasket, and fruit in the refrigerator. Help yourself." She frowned slightly, as if my lack of subservience annoyed her. She poured herself coffee in silence and sat across from me. "About last night," she began, not quite meeting my gaze. "I was tired from the move, stressed by the situation. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." It wasn't a real apology, it was a justification. There was no repentance in her voice, only the convenience of maintaining appearances. Years ago, I would have accepted those empty words to keep the peace. But not anymore. "Lillian," I said calmly, "we both know you said exactly what you wanted to say. What you don't know, however, is that you made a grave mistake." She looked at me in shock. She hadn't expected that answer. Before she could reply, the doorbell rang. "That must be for me," I said, rising. "I'm expecting visitors." At the door stood Grace, her lawyer's briefcase in hand, Robert with his distinguished air of a former police officer, and a public notary Grace had brought to attest to what was about to happen. I invited them in just as Edward came down the stairs, still in his pajamas, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. "Mom, what's going on? Who are these people?" "They're friends of mine, Edward, and they're here for legal matters that concern all of us. Why don't you wake the children? This affects them too." The next few minutes were a blur. David and Sophie stumbled downstairs, still groggy. Lillian demanded explanations. Edward looked utterly lost. We all gathered in the living room, that room where we'd celebrated so many Christmases, where Arthur and I watched television hand in hand every night. Grace took the floor, professional and direct. She explained the existence of the New Dawn Foundation, my role as director, the legal status of the house. She presented the documents. The property titles, the bylaws, all signed and sealed years ago. The notary attested to their authenticity. "In summary," Grace concluded, "this property legally belongs to the New Dawn Foundation, with the condition that Miss Eleanor Hayes resides here as lifelong director. Anyone else living in this house must sign a lease agreement with the foundation and pay monthly rent, or alternatively, vacate within 30 days. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. Edward stared at me as if I were a stranger. Lillian's face transformed from astonishment to pure fury in a matter of seconds. "This is a scam," she shrieked. "Edward, do something. It's your mother, for God's sake. She's crazy. We need to have her committed." "Ms. Walsh," Robert intervened, his voice calm but authoritative, "I suggest you choose your words carefully. Everything Dr. Vance has explained is perfectly legal. The papers have been in order for 5 years. Long before you even thought about moving in here. David sat on the sofa, his expression unreadable, his eyes darting between his mother, me, and the documents. Sophie, for the first time since they arrived, wasn't looking at her phone. She looked like a little girl again, lost and confused. I don't understand, Edward finally whispered. Mom, why did you do this? Why didn't you trust me? His question wounded me more deeply than Lillian's harsh words. In his eyes I saw betrayal, as if I had been the one to break an invisible pact between us. Son, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, this isn't about trust. It's about protection. Not just mine, but that of other seniors who have been abandoned or mistreated. When your father died, I realized how vulnerable a single woman can be at my age. I decided to do something about it, to turn my situation into an opportunity to help others. But you could have told me, Edward insisted. I'm your son. I would never have hurt you. Before I could respond, Lillian let out a bitter laugh. Seriously? Edward, you're so naive. It's clear she did all this because she doesn't trust us. Because she's a manipulative old woman who prefers to give her house to strangers rather than her own family. Lillian, enough? Edward interrupted her, though without much conviction. Enough. Her voice rose with each word. We moved here thinking we could save money, that we'd get a financial break while you looked for work. And now it turns out we have to pay rent or leave. Do you realize what your mother has done? She has deceived us. No one has deceived you, Grace interjected calmly. You assumed the house belonged to Miss Hayes personally, but you never asked. And allow me to remind you, Miss Walsh, that it was you who yesterday told Miss Hayes to go eat with the dogs. That doesn't seem to me to be the attitude of someone who values and respects the person providing them with a roof over their head. Lillian flushed, half embarrassment, half fury. She looked at Edward, seeking support. But my son seemed to be sinking into an abyss of confusion and pain. You have two options, Grace continued, professional until the end. You can sign a lease agreement and remain in the house, paying a monthly rent commensurate with the market, or you can vacate within 30 days. The decision is yours. How much would the rent be? Edward asked, defeated. Grace named a figure that, although fair for a house of that size in that neighborhood, I knew was utterly out of Edward's reach in his current situation. I watched his shoulders slump even further. This is absurd, he murmured. We can't afford that. We barely have enough savings for a couple of months. There's a third option, I said then, feeling that I should offer my son a hand. Despite everything, you can stay temporarily without paying rent, but with some conditions. Grace looked at me in surprise. We hadn't discussed this possibility. What conditions? Edward asked, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Respect, I replied simply. Respect for me, for my house, for my decisions. I am not a servant, nor a burden, nor an obstacle. I am the director of the New Dawn Foundation and the legal owner of this house. If you can accept that, we can negotiate a temporary cost-free stay while Edward finds work. Lillian opened her mouth to protest, but Edward stopped her with a gesture. I need time to process all this, my son said. We can talk later, Mom. Just you and me. I nodded. Grace left the documents on the table, including a draft of the lease agreement and a copy of the foundation's bylaws. The notary certified their delivery, and everyone left, not without exchanging a few private words with me beforehand. Are you sure about this, Eleanor? Grace asked with concern. After what happened last night, it doesn't seem prudent. I have to give my son a chance, I replied. It's not him who disrespected me. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Robert murmured, ever protective. And that tree has rotten roots. I thanked them for their concern but assured them I would be fine. We agreed to maintain daily communication, and at any sign of problems, we would activate the rest of Protocol Dawn, a preventative restraining order and my temporary relocation to Doris's place. The rest of the day passed in intense silence. Lillian locked herself in the master bedroom, refusing to come out even for food. Sophie followed her, shooting me resentful glances as if I had ruined some perfect plan. David, on the other hand, approached me while I was watering the plants in the garden. Grandma, he said softly, I'm so sorry about last night. What Mom said wasn't right. I looked at him tenderly. David had always been a sensitive child, too mature for his age. He reminded me so much of Edward when he was young, before ambition and Lillian's influence transformed him. It's not your fault, my love, I assured him. Adults sometimes complicate our lives unnecessarily. The foundation thing is incredible, he continued, sitting beside me on the wooden bench Arthur had built. Do you really help other grandmas? I told him about our work, about Margaret, a widow kicked out by her son-in-law, about Albert, a widower swindled by his own nephew, about Carmen, who slept on the street because her children sold her house while she was hospitalized. David listened, fascinated, asking intelligent questions, suggesting ideas. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened with Edward and Lillian, my grandson would be fine. He had Arthur's heart and perhaps a little of my determination. As evening fell, Edward finally came to talk to me. We sat in the kitchen, that space that had always been the heart of our home. I poured him a coffee, just as I used to when he was a teenager and came to me with his problems. Why, Mom? He asked bluntly. Why didn't you tell me anything about the foundation? At first it was just a precaution, I explained. I saw cases in the news of elderly people swindled by their own children, or abandoned in nursing homes. Then I met Doris and her story, and others who'd been through similar situations. I realized I could do more than just protect myself. But I would never have done anything like that to you, he insisted, hurt. I looked him in the eyes, those eyes so much like his father's. Edward, when your father was alive, you came to see us every week. After his death, visits became spaced out. There was always an excuse. Work, the children, commitments. I don't blame you. Life goes on and you have your own responsibilities. But it made me realize how alone I was, how vulnerable. And yes, I also saw how Lillian looked at this house, how she made comments about selling it, about it being too big for me. It wasn't hard to imagine what would happen if one day, I couldn't fend for myself. Edward remained silent, staring into his coffee cup as if searching for answers to questions he didn't even know he had. About last night, he began, clearly uncomfortable. What Lillian said wasn't right. I should have defended you. Yes, you should have, I agreed, not to punish him, but without sugarcoating the truth. Your silence hurt more than her words. Things haven't been easy lately, he confessed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded me so much of Arthur. Losing my job, the mortgage, the kids' tuition. Lillian is stressed. I'm stressed. We came here because we had no other option. But I guess she saw it as an opportunity to, I don't know, to take control of something amidst the chaos. I understand the stress, son. But that doesn't justify disrespect. This house has been and will always be your home. But not at the expense of my dignity. Edward nodded slowly, as if for the first time, truly assimilating the magnitude of what had happened and what was at stake. What's going to happen now? He asked. That depends on you, I replied. As I said before, you can stay temporarily without paying rent, but on the condition of mutual respect. Lillian will have to apologize, not only to me but to the entire family for her behavior. And we'll have to establish some basic rules for living together. Edward murmured something about Lillian not being good at apologizing. Then she'll have to learn, I said firmly, or find somewhere else to live. The conversation continued late into the night. We talked about his job search, the children, the foundation. At times I felt like I was getting back my Edward, that sensitive and fair boy Arthur and I had raised. But I also saw the man trapped between his loyalty to me and to the woman he had chosen as his life partner. When he finally went to sleep, I stayed alone in the kitchen with only the company of the old wall clock that Arthur had repaired so many times. I thought of him, of what he would have done in my place. Arthur was always a fair man, but also tremendously loyal to his family. He would have approved of my actions. He would have understood my motives. Arthur, I whispered into the empty kitchen. I hope I'm doing the right thing. That night I didn't sleep well. I tossed and turned, reviewing the day's events, wondering if I should have been tougher, or perhaps more flexible. At some point, I heard angry voices from the master bedroom. Edward and Lillian were arguing, their words muffled by the walls, but the intensity of their anger clearly perceptible. The next morning, Lillian didn't come down for breakfast. Edward looked exhausted, with deep circles under his eyes and a defeated expression. The children were unusually silent. The atmosphere in the house was like the calm before a storm. Heavy, oppressive, charged with electricity. "Lillian says she prefers to leave," Edward announced as he poured himself coffee. "She says she can't live under these conditions, that it's humiliating." I wasn't surprised. Lillian had always been proud, seemingly incapable of admitting her mistakes or offering a genuine apology. "And what do you think?" I asked, steeling myself for any answer. Edward sighed deeply. "I don't know what to think, Mom. On one hand, I understand your position. What Lillian did was wrong, and your conditions are reasonable. On the other hand, she's my wife, the mother of my children. We're going through a difficult time, and I don't want to divide the family further. Sometimes," I said, choosing my words carefully, "keeping a family together at any cost can do more harm than good. Respect must be the foundation of any relationship, Edward. Without that, there is only domination and submission." My son looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, or perhaps rediscovering something in me he had forgotten over the years. "You were always strong, weren't you? Even when you seemed to give in to Dad, even when you let us make our own decisions even if you didn't agree. That wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of strength." I smiled, touched by his belated but sincere understanding. "Life has taught me that there are many ways to be strong, son. And sometimes the greatest strength is in setting clear boundaries." That day, Lillian packed her bags. She decided to go to her sister's house in Miami, Florida, taking Sophie with her. Edward and David would stay with me while he continued looking for work. The farewell was tense, devoid of tears or hugs. Lillian barely looked at me, and Sophie offered a cold kiss on the cheek at her father's insistence. As the taxi drove away, carrying half the family, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I didn't want to be the cause of their separation, but I also couldn't continue to allow such treatment. Did I do the right thing? I asked Robert that night, who had come for tea to check that everything was all right. "You did what was necessary," he replied with that quiet wisdom that always comforted me. "Sometimes both things coincide, sometimes they don't. But it's always better to live according to your principles than to betray yourself to please others." The following days were a period of intense adjustment. Edward spent hours sending resumes, attending interviews, making calls. David volunteered at the foundation, fascinated by the idea of helping others. And little by little I regained my place in my own home, my voice, my dignity. One afternoon, as David and I were sorting donations in the living room, Edward walked in with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. "Eleanor," he announced, "I have an interview tomorrow for a supervisor position at a new construction company. The salary isn't as good as before, but it's a start." I hugged him, genuinely happy for him. Perhaps this crisis, as painful as it had been, would be the catalyst for a new beginning for everyone. That night, after dinner, Edward handed me an envelope. "It's from Lillian," he explained. "She asked me to give it to you." With some apprehension, I opened it and read the letter. It was brief, just a few lines, but it took my breath away. "Dear Eleanor," it read in her elegant handwriting. "Circumstances have forced me to reflect on my actions. I recognize that my behavior was unacceptable, and I apologize for the pain I have caused. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am working on being a better person for Edward, for the children, and for myself. Sincerely, Lillian." It wasn't a particularly emotional or lengthy letter, but coming from Lillian, it was almost revolutionary. I looked at Edward, who was carefully observing my reaction. "She's seeing a therapist," he explained. "It was her sister's idea. It seems this situation has made her confront some things from her past, from her relationship with her own mother." I nodded, not knowing exactly what to say. People are rarely entirely villains. Most act from their own wounds, from their deepest fears. "Do you think one day we can be a family again?" Edward asked, and in his voice, I heard the child who once asked me if the sun would rise again after a particularly strong storm. "Time will tell," I replied, putting the letter away. "But to rebuild, you first have to acknowledge what's broken." And it seems that process has already begun. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into a full month. Since that first day when Lillian ordered me to eat with the dogs, spring was advancing in Willow Creek, painting my garden with colors and scents that always reminded me of Arthur. He loved this time of year, when we could sit on the back patio and watch the flowers push their way through the damp earth, promising new life. Edward got the job at the construction company. It wasn't the executive position he had before, but it would allow him to start rebuilding his financial life. David continued helping me with the foundation, showing surprising sensitivity and maturity for his 17 years. We talked with Sophie on video calls almost every day. I noticed she was different, more thoughtful, less engrossed in her phone, and more present in our conversations. One particularly sunny morning, as I was having breakfast with Edward and David, the doorbell rang. It was Grace, my lawyer and friend, with an indecipherable expression. "Miss Hayes," she said after the greetings, "I need to speak with you about an important matter, in private if possible." I led her to Arthur's study, that small corner of the house where he kept his poetry books, and I kept my important documents. Edward followed us with his eyes, concern evident on his face. "What's going on, Grace?" I asked once we closed the door. "You're scaring me. A delicate situation has arisen," she explained, taking some documents from her briefcase. "I received a call yesterday from a lawyer representing Lillian Walsh." My heart skipped a beat. Despite the apology letter, a part of me had always feared that Lillian would try something legal against the foundation or against me. "What does she want?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "It's not what you think," Grace reassured me. "She's not coming to claim anything. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Lillian wants to make a donation to the New Dawn Foundation." I was speechless. Of all the possibilities I could have imagined, this was the last. A donation from Lillian? I stammered, unable to hide my astonishment. Grace nodded. "Just as perplexed as I am. According to her lawyer, she has sold some of her jewelry and wants to donate the money specifically for family mediation programs between seniors and their children or daughters-in-law. She says it's her way of making amends." I slowly sat in Arthur's chair, trying to process this information. The Lillian I knew would never have sold her precious jewelry, much less to donate the money to a cause unrelated to her interests. "How much?" I finally asked. $10,000, Grace replied. "It's not a huge amount for the foundation, but considering her current financial situation, it's significant." Her lawyer mentioned that it was jewelry given to her by her father. Her father's jewelry. Now I understood better. Lillian rarely spoke of her family, but Edward had told me that her relationship with her parents had been complicated. Her father, a wealthy businessman, had showered her with material gifts but withheld affection. Her mother, as far as I knew, had been a distant and critical woman, obsessed with appearances. "Is there anything else?" Grace continued. "Lillian has requested a meeting with you, just the two of you, without lawyers, without family. She says she has something important to tell you in person." The mere idea of being alone with Lillian sent a shiver down my spine. Our last interaction had been so unpleasant that the prospect of reliving it, even under different circumstances, filled me with anxiety. "You don't have to accept," Grace clarified, seeing my expression. "I can politely decline the request, or suggest a meeting with mediators present." I took a deep breath, remembering what Arthur always said. "Fear is natural, Eleanor, but don't let it stop you from doing the right thing." "I'll see her," I decided, "but here in my house, with Edward and David present in the house, though not necessarily in the same room." Grace accepted my terms and promised to organize the meeting for the following week. When we left the study, Edward was waiting in the hallway with a worried expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked, looking alternately at Grace and me. "Everything is fine," I assured him. "But we need to talk. Lillian has requested a meeting with me." The news surprised Edward, who ran a hand through his hair in that gesture of his that always reminded me of his father. "What for? What does she want now?" he asked with a hint of bitterness. Despite the letter and the video calls with the children, their relationship remained tense. I explained about the donation and the meeting request. Edward listened with an incredulous expression. She sold her father's jewelry? I can't believe it. Lillian adored that jewelry. It was her last link to him. People can change, son, I said. Though I had my own reservations, or at least they can try. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with preparation, both practical and emotional. Robert insisted on being present on the day of the visit, even if he was just in the garden pruning roses. David offered to bake cookies, remembering that Lillian liked chocolate chip with walnuts. Edward fluctuated between hope and skepticism, not knowing what to expect from this new Lillian, who seemed to be emerging from the ashes of our conflict. The morning of the meeting dawned cloudy, with that diffused light that softens contours and blurs shadows. I dressed with special care, choosing a light blue outfit that Arthur always said highlighted the color of my eyes. It wasn't vanity. It was a way to arm myself with confidence, to remind myself who I was and everything I had overcome in my 68 years of life. Lillian arrived punctually, driving herself instead of taking a taxi as we expected. I watched her from the window as she parked in front of the house. She looked different, less rigid in her movements. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate hairstyle she usually wore. She was dressed simply, almost austerely for her usual standards. Edward opened the door, his face a mask of studied neutrality. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, a brief hug that seemed more procedural than affectionate, and then Edward led her to the living room where I was waiting. When our gazes met, I saw something I had never seen before in Lillian's eyes: vulnerability. She wasn't the haughty, dominant woman who had ordered me to eat with the dogs. She seemed smaller somehow, as if something inside her had deflated. "Good morning, Eleanor," she greeted in a soft, unsure voice. "Thank you for seeing me." "Good morning, Lillian," I replied, motioning for her to take a seat opposite me. "Can I offer you coffee or tea?" "Tea would be nice. Thank you." Edward left to prepare it, leaving us alone in an uncomfortable silence that seemed to amplify with each passing second. Finally Lillian spoke. "I've been seeing a therapist," she began, looking at her intertwined hands in her lap. "At first it was at my sister's insistence, but then I started to see things about myself, about my patterns, things that aren't pleasant to acknowledge." I remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. What she was doing wasn't easy. I could see it in the tension of her shoulders, in how she avoided my direct gaze. "My mother," she continued after a pause, "was very much like me. Or rather, I became someone very much like her. Controlling, perfectionistic, unable to show vulnerability. She believed respect was imposed, not earned. I treated others as she treated me." Edward returned with the tea, poured it in silence, and then retreated again, respecting our space but staying close enough to intervene if necessary. "What I did to you," Lillian continued after a sip of her tea, "what I said to you that day was unforgivable. But it wasn't just about you. It was about me and my insecurities. When Edward lost his job, I felt like I was losing control of my life. Moving into your house, depending on your help, made me feel small, defenseless. And I reacted by trying to control the only thing I could, the space, the family dynamics. I made you the target of my frustration." Her words surprised me, not so much for their content, but for their raw honesty. The Lillian I knew would never have admitted weakness or error. "The donation," she continued, now looking directly at me, "it's not an attempt to buy your forgiveness. I know what I did can't be erased with money. It's my way of acknowledging the value of your work, of contributing something positive after so much negativity. The jewelry was important to me, but more important is trying to repair the harm I've caused." "And Sophie?" I asked, thinking of my granddaughter who had witnessed everything. "How is she?" Lillian's expression softened as she spoke of her daughter. "She's good, better than good. In fact, this situation has made her see things too. She was starting to follow in my footsteps, to adopt my attitudes. Seeing the consequences of my behavior was like a mirror for her. We're learning together to be different." I took a moment to process everything. One part of me, the wounded and cautious part, wondered if this was genuine or just a strategy to move back into the house without paying rent. But another part, perhaps the part Arthur always encouraged in me, wanted to believe in the possibility of change. Lillian, I finally said, I appreciate your honesty and your donation. The foundation can do a lot of good with that money. As for everything else, forgiveness isn't something that's given once and forever. It's a process, both for the one who forgives and for the one who is forgiven. She nodded, accepting my words without protest. I don't expect us to go back to how we were, she clarified. Honestly, I don't think we ever had a real relationship. Just a series of superficial exchanges marked by my judgment and your silent resentment. But perhaps we can build something new, something based on mutual respect for Edward, for the children, and for ourselves. At that moment, David entered with a tray of freshly baked cookies, his quiet way of participating in this reconciliation. Lillian looked at him with surprise and emotion. Did you make these? She asked, recognizing her favorite cookies. With Grandma's recipe, David confirmed with a small smile. Though I think I put in too many walnuts. There are never too many walnuts, Lillian replied. And for a moment, a brief and precious moment, we all smiled. The conversation continued, more relaxed now, with David acting as a bridge between us. We talked about Sophie, about school, about the foundation. Edward eventually joined us, and although the tension between him and Lillian was palpable, there was also a tacit understanding, a shared willingness to find a way forward. When it was time to say goodbye, Lillian approached me with cautious movements, as if she feared breaking the fragile peace we had built. Thank you, she said simply, for listening, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for taking the first step, I replied. And on an impulse that surprised both her and me, I offered her a hug. It was brief, awkward, but sincere. A small act of courage on both our parts. After Lillian left, I stood on the porch watching her car drive away. Edward stood beside me in silence for a moment, and then he said, I've never seen her like that. So vulnerable. Crises have a way of doing that, I replied, thinking of my own transformations over the years. They force us to look inside ourselves and confront what we find, whether good or bad. Do you think she's sincere? He asked, doubt still present in his voice. Time will tell, I answered. But I think she's making a genuine effort, and that's already something valuable. That night, after Edward and David had gone to sleep, I went out to the backyard to gaze at the stars, something I used to do with Arthur on clear nights. I silently told him about my day, about Lillian, about the small and large changes that were happening in our family. I wish you were here to see it, my love, I whispered to the starry sky, to advise me to hold my hand as we navigate these unknown waters. The wind gently rustled the leaves of the old orange tree, and for a moment I felt as if Arthur answered me, as if he told me I was doing the right thing, that forgiveness was not weakness, but the greatest of strengths. Robert found me there, contemplating the stars. He had come to check that everything was all right, as he did every night since the incident. How are you, Eleanor? He asked, sitting beside me on the wooden bench. Confused, I admitted. Hopeful, cautious, all at once. It's natural, he said with that deep, reassuring voice of his. You've been through a lot, and this situation with Lillian is complicated. Life is rarely simple, isn't it? I smiled. Rarely, I agreed. But that's what makes it interesting. If everything were easy and predictable, where would the adventure be? We laughed together under the starry sky. Two old friends sharing a moment of peace amidst the storm that had been my life in recent weeks. And for the first time since that fateful day when Lillian ordered me to eat with the dogs, I felt that things could eventually be all right. I didn't know what the future held for our family, whether Lillian and Edward would completely reconcile, whether we would all live under the same roof again, whether the wounds would heal completely or leave permanent scars. But I had taken a step towards forgiveness, not out of weakness or convenience, but by conscious choice, out of a genuine desire to break the cycle of resentment and control that had marked our relationships. And that night, as the stars shone over Willow Creek, I felt that I had honored the name my parents gave me at birth. Eleanor, meaning light or shining one. Because even in the darkest moments, even when all seemed lost, I had kept the flame of hope alive, the belief that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. The following weeks passed with a strange normalcy. as if we were all learning again to be a family, but with different rules, with greater awareness of our limits and vulnerabilities. Edward adapted to his new job, coming home tired but satisfied each evening. David continued helping me with the foundation, showing surprising sensitivity and maturity for his 17 years. And I, at 68, discovered a new version of myself. Firmer, more confident, but also more open to the possibility of reconciliation. Lillian and Sophie were still in Miami, but video calls became more frequent and less tense. Little by little, Lillian began to show genuine interest in the foundation, asking about our projects, offering ideas from her experience in administration. Sophie, for her part, surprised me one day by asking if she could come spend a weekend with me. "Just with you, Grandma," she clarified on the phone. "I want you to teach me how to make those walnut cookies David likes so much. And I also want to talk about things." That "about things" hinted at much more than her words revealed. I knew it immediately. Sophie at 14 was at that difficult stage where you're no longer a child but not yet an adult, where everything seems confusing and emotions are intense and overwhelming. "Of course, my love," I replied. "You can come whenever you want. Your room is always ready for you." When that weekend arrived, I was surprised by the change in my granddaughter. The teenager who had left with a frown and a defiant attitude had been replaced by a calmer, more present young woman. Her hair, previously streaked with purple, had returned to its natural brown. Her eyes, so much like Edward's when he was young, looked at me with a mixture of remorse and curiosity. "The house looks different," she commented as she put her small suitcase in the room I had prepared for her. "Or maybe it's me who sees things differently now." "Perhaps a little of both," I replied. "Houses, like people, change with time and experiences." That afternoon we baked cookies together, getting flour on our aprons, laughing when a batch came out too toasted, singing old songs I had taught her when she was little. It was in those simple moments, covered in sugar and oven warmth, that Sophie began to open up. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said suddenly as she shaped the dough, "for how I behaved that day when Mom said those horrible things to you. I shouldn't have." Her voice trembled slightly, and I could see that she struggled to look me in the eyes. "You were a child following your mother's example," I replied softly. "We all make mistakes, Sophie. The important thing is to learn from them. Mom has changed," she continued. "Or she's trying to. Sometimes she cries when she thinks I'm not looking. And she talks a lot about you. About how strong you are. About how you created something good after becoming a widow instead of becoming bitter." Her words moved me deeply. I never would have imagined that Lillian would speak of me in those terms, that she would see me as an example of strength instead of a rival for Edward's affection. "We are all more complex than we appear at first glance," I told her as I wiped a little flour from her cheek. "Your mother included. People aren't just good or bad, Sophie. We are mixtures of light and shadow, of strength and weakness. Like that story you used to tell me when I was little," she recalled with a nostalgic smile. "The one about the broken vase that was repaired with gold and became more beautiful than before." "Kintsugi," I nodded, surprised she remembered that bedtime story. "The Japanese art of repairing broken things with gold, transforming scars into beauty." "Exactly like that, my dear." That night after dinner we sat on the back porch under the stars, wrapped in blankets despite the mild weather. Sophie told me about her new school in Miami, about a literature teacher who had inspired her to write poetry, about her plans to study psychology someday. "To help people like Mom and like you, Grandma." "Like me?" I asked, intrigued. "People who have been through difficult things but keep going," she explained. "Who use their pain to help others instead of becoming bitter." Her words, so mature for her age, made me think about how crises not only affect us but also those around us, especially the younger ones who observe how we respond to adversity. Before she left, Sophie hugged me tightly, whispering, "I love you, Grandma," which was worth more than any formal apology. Then she asked me a question that took me by surprise. "Do you think Mom and you can ever truly be friends? Not just tolerate each other for Dad and for us, but genuinely appreciate each other?" I looked into her eyes, those hopeful eyes, and knew I had to be honest. "I don't know, my love. Deep wounds take time to heal. But I believe we can build something new and valuable based on mutual respect. And who knows, Maybe with time that respect will transform into genuine affection. She seemed satisfied with my answer, or at least hopeful enough to continue believing in the possibility of a reconstructed family, different from before, but equally valid. The true turning point came a month later when Robert suffered a heart attack while working in his garden. It was David who found him, who called the ambulance, who stayed by his side until the paramedics arrived. When I received the call, I felt the ground open beneath my feet. Robert, my faithful friend, my constant support since Arthur's death, was fighting for his life at Portland Regional Medical Center. Edward immediately drove me to the hospital. He drove in silence, respecting my distress. In the waiting room as the doctors worked to stabilize Robert, I felt vulnerable again, reminded of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change. What I never expected was to receive a call from Lillian barely an hour later. "I heard about Robert," she said without preamble. "I'm taking the first flight to Portland." "You don't need to come," I replied, confused by her reaction. "Edward is with me, and David too." "I know," her voice sounded resolute, "but I want to be there. Robert was kind to me even when I didn't deserve it. And you shouldn't go through this alone." I didn't know what to say. The Lillian I knew would never have taken an emergency flight to support her mother-in-law and an elderly neighbor. However, 8 hours later, she appeared in the hospital waiting room with Sophie, both looking tired but determined. "How is he?" she asked, hugging Edward first, then David, and finally, with some shyness, me. "Stable but critical," I replied, still surprised by her presence. "The doctors say the next 48 hours will be decisive." Lillian nodded and, without another word, took off her coat, folded it carefully, and sat beside me. Sophie did the same on my other side, taking my hand in silence. And so we remained, an improbable family, united by common concern, by shared affection for a man who had been a silent witness to our conflicts and reconciliations. During the 3 days Robert was in intensive care, Lillian didn't leave our side. She organized shifts so that someone was always at the hospital. She brought homemade food, so we wouldn't have to eat the bland hospital cafeteria offerings. She even managed to get a nurse to let us see Robert outside visiting hours. One night, while everyone else dozed in the waiting room, Lillian sat next to me with 2 cups of tea. "I couldn't sleep," she explained, offering me one. "And I thought maybe you couldn't either." I accepted the tea with a gesture of gratitude. Exhaustion and worry had broken down the usual barriers between us, allowing for a conversation that under other circumstances would have been impossible. "I was always afraid of getting old," Lillian confessed after a silence. "Seeing Robert like this, so vulnerable despite having been a strong man all his life, makes me think about my own future." "Aging isn't for cowards," I replied with a small smile. "But it has its rewards. Wisdom, perspective, the freedom to finally be yourself without worrying so much about what others think." "You don't seem to be afraid," she observed. "Oh, I am," I admitted. "Afraid of dependence, of loneliness, of becoming a burden to Edward or the children. That's why I created the foundation, not just to protect myself legally, but to build a support network, to feel that I can still contribute in some way." Lillian was silent, reflecting on my words. Then, in an almost inaudible voice, she said, "I underestimated you. I thought you were weak because you were kind, that you were naive because you were generous. I was wrong. And I judged you as purely selfish and manipulative," I acknowledged without looking at her. "Without realizing that perhaps you were acting from your own fears and insecurities. I was wrong too." We exchanged a look of mutual understanding, the first moment of genuine connection in 20 years of knowing each other. We weren't friends. We probably never would be in the traditional sense, but a mutual respect had been born, a recognition of each other's humanity beyond the roles of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law we had been playing. Robert survived, weak but determined to recover. He was moved to a regular room where we could visit him more freely. It was there, in that hospital room smelling of disinfectant and medicine, that something happened that would change the course of our family forever. We were all gathered. Edward, David, Sophie, Lillian, and I. Robert, pale but with lively eyes, watched us from his bed with a tired smile. "Well," he commented, his voice weak but humor intact, "I had to have a heart attack to see the entire Hayes family reunited and at peace." We laughed because it was true. Despite the painful circumstances, there was something beautiful about all of us being there, worried about him, supporting each other. You should stay like this, Robert continued. United. Life's too short to waste on grudges. His words, simple yet profound, resonated with all of us. Lillian was the first to respond, surprising everyone. You're right, Robert, she said firmly. And that's why I want to propose something. She turned to Edward, then to me. I've been thinking a lot these past few weeks about family, about what truly matters, and I think we should try again. All of us together but differently. What exactly are you suggesting? Edward asked, cautious but interested. That we move back to Willow Creek, she replied. But not as before. I propose we convert the house into 2 independent units. Eleanor would keep the ground floor, which is already adapted for her, and we would take the second floor with its own entrance. Each of us would have our space, our privacy, but close enough to support each other. And we would pay fair rent to the foundation as is appropriate. Her proposal left us all speechless. It was practical, respectful, and showed that she had understood the core of the conflict. The need for independence and mutual respect. What do you think, Mom? Edward asked me. It's your house, your decision. I looked at my family, these complex and sometimes difficult people, but who were, after all, my blood, my legacy, my reason for going on after losing Arthur. I thought about what he would have wanted, what I truly wanted. I think, I finally said, that it could work. With clear rules, with firm commitments, with the foundation always as the legal owner. But yes, we could try. Sophie's smile lit up the room. David nodded in approval. Edward looked relieved, as if a weight he had been carrying finally lightened. And Lillian looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before when she addressed me. Genuine gratitude. We'll seal this properly, Robert declared from his bed. When I get out of here, we'll have dinner together in Eleanor's garden and toast to new beginnings. 3 weeks later, with Robert recovering at his home, we fulfilled that promise. The garden that Arthur and I had cultivated with so much love was filled with voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Edward was grilling meat on the barbecue. Lillian and Sophie were setting the table. David and I were putting the finishing touches on the salad. Robert watched everything from his place of honor, still weak, but visibly happy to see us reunited. As we sat down to eat under the starry Oregon sky, surrounded by the scent of spring flowers, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't a naive peace, born of the belief that all our problems had disappeared. It was a mature peace, aware that there would be difficult days, disagreements, moments of tension, but also with the certainty that we now had better tools to face them. Honest communication, respect for each other's boundaries, the willingness to forgive without forgetting the lessons learned. During dessert, Edward proposed a toast. To Mom, he said, raising his glass, who taught us that true strength isn't in dominating others, but in staying true to oneself. To Lillian, who had the courage to look within herself and change. To our children, who are wiser than we were at their age. And to Robert, our guardian angel, who almost had to die to bring us to our senses. We laughed and toasted, and when the glasses clinked together in the center of the table, I knew that that terrible day when Lillian ordered me to eat with the dogs had paradoxically been the catalyst for something beautiful. A reconstructed family. Not perfect, not idyllic, but authentic and resilient. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I went out to the garden to gaze at the stars once more. I felt Arthur's presence beside me, as real as the flowers surrounding us, as comforting as ever. We did it, my love, I whispered into the night wind. Not as we expected, not without pain, but we did it. Our family is moving forward, transformed but united. And I'm still here, stronger than I ever imagined I could be. And as the night dew began to form on the flowers Arthur and I had planted so many years ago, I understood that my name had never been more appropriate, because that was me. That had always been me, Eleanor, which means light, or shining one. Not the blind hope that ignores reality, but the tenacious hope that persists despite it, that finds paths where there seem to be none, that transforms pain into purpose and wounds into wisdom. My story began with a humiliation and ended with a reconciliation. A journey I never would have imagined when Lillian, my son's wife, ordered me to eat with the dogs that first day they came to live in my house. But life has unexpected ways of teaching us, of transforming us, of reminding us who we truly are. I am Eleanor Hayes, and today I've shared how a moment of dignity changed the course of my family forever. What about you? What would you have done in my shoes? I'd really love to hear your thoughts, so drop them in the comments below. I'm always curious to know what you think.